Who let the janitor into this room? The question cut through polished air like something sharp and expensive, and a few executives actually laughed under their breath. This is a board meeting, not a maintenance call. Someone get him out of here. The single dad didn't flinch. He just stood there, hands steady, eyes scanning the screens like he understood them better than anyone else. And in a few minutes, that same room would fall silent because of him. Because this wasn't about a janitor, it was about power no one recognized. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Relax, the man in work boots said quietly, his voice calm in a room that wasn't built for people like him. I'll be out in a second. Just notice something you might want to see first. No one responded right away. Not because they respected him, but because of the tone. It wasn't defensive. I wasn't nervous. It was certain. Ethan Cole stood near the edge of the boardroom, still holding the cleaning cart handle with one hand. The fluorescent light from the hallway behind him framed his silhouette, making him look like he'd wandered into the wrong world. But his eyes didn't match that assumption. They moved across the digital displays, shipment maps, data streams, red markers blinking in clusters, like he was reading a language he hadn't forgotten. The CEO, Marcus Vance, leaned back in his leather chair, irritation written across his face. He wasn't used to interruptions, especially not from someone wearing a faded uniform and scuffed boots. You notice something? He repeated, voice dripping with disbelief. I assure you we have entire departments for that. A few of the board members smirked. One of them, Clara Duval, didn't laugh, but she didn't intervene either. She simply watched. Ethan didn't step further into the room. He didn't shrink either. Yeah, he said simply. You've got a delay pattern forming in your west corridor routes. It's stacking faster than your system's compensating. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to register. Daniel Reyes, the COO, scoffed openly. That's impossible. The system auto-balances those variables. It's been stress-tested for months. Not for that configuration, Ethan replied, nodding slightly toward one of the screens. You've got overlapping reroutes feeding into the same choke point. It's subtle now, but give it 20 minutes, and it won't be. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but something changed. Marcus straightened slightly, annoyance flickering into something sharper. And you determined this while mopping the floors? Ethan's grip on the cart tightened just a fraction. I saw the pattern, he said. Another executive chuckled. This is ridiculous. Security, wait. Clara's voice cut in, controlled and firm. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the screen Ethan had indicated. Which corridor did you say? Ethan pointed, not dramatically, just precisely. There, and there. Those two feeds shouldn't be converging like that unless your predictive model's misreading demand spikes. Daniel frowned, tapping rapidly on his tablet. That's not. He stopped. A flicker of red expanded across the screen. Small at first, then slightly larger. The kind of thing that wouldn't alarm someone who didn't know what it meant. But Daniel knew, and the way his jaw tightened told everyone else that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as absurd as it had sounded a moment ago. Marcus noticed it too. His expression didn't soften, but it sharpened. What exactly are you implying? He asked, voice lower now. Ethan didn't rush. I'm saying your system's about to bottleneck, and if it does, everything behind it stacks. You won't clear it fast enough. Silence settled. Not comfortable. Not complete, but heavy enough to feel. Daniel cleared his throat. Even if there's a minor delay, we can redirect flow. That's the entire point of the system. Ethan nodded once. Yeah, if you catch it early, another beat. Clara's fingers hovered over her tablet. Run a projection, she said quietly. Daniel hesitated, but only for a second before executing the command. The screen shifted, recalculating. Lines adjusted. Colors deepened. And then, a surge of red, not catastrophic, not yet. But unmistakably wrong. The room didn't laugh this time. Marcus exhaled slowly, his irritation now tangled with something else, control slipping, even if only slightly. He looked back at Ethan, studying him properly for the first time. How long until this becomes a real problem? Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. You've got maybe 15 minutes before it cascades. Daniel shook his head. We can stabilize that. Ethan met his gaze evenly. You can try. The words weren't aggressive. They weren't challenging. They were factual. And somehow, that made them heavier. Marcus leaned forward, elbows resting on the table now. The power dynamic in the room hadn't flipped, but it had shifted enough to feel unstable. You're telling me, he said slowly, that my executive team missed something, and you caught it walking past with a mop? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked once more to the screen, tracking the growing pattern like it was already unfolding in his head. I didn't miss it, he said finally. I've seen it before. That landed differently. Not just a lucky guess, not just observation, experience. Clara's gaze sharpened further. Daniel's confidence wavered just enough to notice. And Marcus didn't like uncertainty. But it was there now, sitting in his boardroom wearing a janitor's uniform. And the worst part? The clock was still ticking. The silence didn't break, it stretched. Marcus tapped his fingers once against the polished table, a small, controlled motion that usually meant he was deciding how to regain control. 15 minutes, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the number. And you're confident in that? Ethan didn't move from where he stood. I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't. Daniel exhaled sharply, already pulling up additional system layers on his tablet. We're not taking operational advice from, he gestured vaguely, that this has just predicted a failure your model didn't flag, Clara said, not looking up from her screen. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was clinical. Observational. Daniel's jaw tightened. It's a minor anomaly. We'll correct it. On the main display, the red clusters pulsed again, slightly larger now, slightly faster. Ethan watched it happen. Not with panic, with recognition. You're already behind it, he said quietly. Marcus's eyes snapped back to him. Explain. Daniel cut in before Ethan could respond. He doesn't need to explain anything. We've got this under control. His fingers moved faster now, issuing commands, rerouting traffic, adjusting variables. See? Redistribution protocol. The screen flickered. For a second, everything seemed stable. Then a second wave of red surged, wider, deeper, spreading into adjacent roots like a crack running through glass. The room shifted again. Not subtle this time. Clara leaned forward. That's not stabilizing. Daniel froze, just for a heartbeat. Then he doubled down. It's recalibrating. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, you just fed more load into the same choke point. Marcus stood now, slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that made everyone else straighten without realizing it. Daniel, he said, voice calm but edged. Is he right? Daniel didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation, that fraction of a second, said more than any words could. Ethan stepped forward one pace. Not enough to intrude, just enough to be heard clearly. Your system's predicting demand spikes based on outdated flow data. It's overcompensating, sending traffic where it thinks capacity exists. He nodded toward the screen. But those routes are already saturated, so every correction makes it worse. Marcus's gaze flicked between Ethan and the display. And your solution? Another executive scoffed quietly. We're seriously doing this? Marcus didn't look at him. We're seriously avoiding a multi-million-dollar failure, he replied. So unless you have a better idea, you'll stay quiet. That shut the room down. Ethan didn't rush. He never did. You need to isolate the false signals first, he said. Cut the predictive layer temporarily. Run manual distribution based on real-time capacity, not projections. Daniel let out a short, incredulous laugh. That would cripple efficiency. We'd lose throughput immediately. You're about to lose everything, Ethan said, still calm. Throughput doesn't matter if the system locks up. Clara looked between them. How long would manual control hold? Long enough to clear the backlog, Ethan answered. If you move fast, Daniel shook his head, more forcefully now. This is insane. We've spent years building this system. You don't just shut it off because someone like him, thinks there's a pattern. Someone like me? Ethan echoed, not offended, just curious. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear. Marcus exhaled slowly, tension building behind his composed exterior. We're running out of time. His eyes settled on Ethan again. If you're wrong, I know, Ethan said. That stopped him, not the words, the certainty behind them. Clara spoke again, quieter this time. What made you see it? Ethan's gaze drifted back to the screen, following the expanding red like it was a map he'd memorized years ago. Patterns repeat, he said. Different systems. Same mistakes. Daniel scoffed again, but it sounded thinner now. You're talking like you've, managed operations at this scale? Ethan didn't answer that. And somehow that silence said more than any explanation could. Marcus noticed it. He noticed everything now, the way Ethan stood, the way he spoke, the way he didn't try to impress anyone. It didn't fit the image they'd assigned him. Nothing about this fit anymore. The red clusters pulsed again, larger, faster. A notification flashed across the screen. Delay escalation, 12%. Clara's voice cut through the tension. That's climbing too fast. Daniel's hands moved again, issuing more commands, but his confidence was cracking. It showed in the slight tremor of his fingers, in the way his eyes darted between data points. Ethan watched him struggle. He didn't step in yet, not because he couldn't, but because he understood something the others didn't. They still thought this was about control. It wasn't. It was about timing. Marcus turned fully toward Ethan now. No mockery left, no dismissal, just a hard, evaluating stare. If we do what you're suggesting, he said, you're taking responsibility for it. Ethan met his gaze evenly. I already am, another beat. Then Marcus made the call. Daniel, disable predictive routing. Switch to manual distribution. Daniel stared at him. Marcus, I strongly advise. That wasn't a discussion. Silence. Then, reluctantly, Daniel executed the command. The system shifted. The predictive layer dimmed. Manual controls activated. For a moment, just a moment, the red stopped spreading. The room held its breath. Then Ethan spoke again. Now reroute those two corridors separately. Don't let them converge. Daniel hesitated, but only for a second this time before following the instruction. The red clusters flickered. Paused. And then, very slowly, began to shrink. Clara exhaled, almost inaudibly. Marcus didn't move. But something in his posture changed. Something subtle. Something real. Across the room, a few of the executives exchanged glances. The kind that said everything without words. The janitor had just done what they couldn't. And the worst part? He hadn't even raised his voice. Before we go further, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next, it changes everything in that room. The red didn't disappear all at once. It receded. Slowly. Reluctantly, like the system itself was resisting correction after being pushed too far in the wrong direction. Everyone in the room watched it happen in silence. No one spoke. No one dared break the fragile shift unfolding across the massive screen. What had looked like the beginning of a collapse just minutes ago was now stabilizing. Not perfectly, but enough. Daniel leaned closer to his tablet, eyes scanning rapidly. Load distribution is evening out, he muttered, almost to himself. Backlogs decreasing. Clara didn't look at him. Percentage? Daniel swallowed. Down to 9% and still dropping. Another quiet beat passed. Marcus remained standing at the head of the table, arms folded now, not in dominance, but in focus. His attention hadn't left Ethan since the system began correcting. "You said 15 minutes," Marcus said finally. Ethan nodded once. "You caught it early enough. Because you pointed it out," Ethan didn't respond. The distinction mattered, but he didn't claim it. Daniel exhaled sharply, tension bleeding into frustration. "This doesn't prove anything," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. "It was a temporary imbalance. We corrected it." Ethan's gaze shifted to him, calm, direct. "No," he said. "You didn't." Daniel stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You stopped it from getting worse," Ethan continued, his tone steady. "That's not the same as fixing it." The room tightened again. Clara's eyes flicked back to the screen. The red was shrinking, but not gone. Pockets of it still lingered, flickering like embers that hadn't fully burned out. "What happens if we switch predictive routing back on?" she asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "It starts again." Daniel shook his head immediately. "That's speculation. It's pattern recognition," Ethan replied. Marcus stepped closer to the table, his attention now fully locked in. "Then why hasn't it triggered before?" he asked. That was the question, the real one. Ethan glanced at the data, then at Marcus. "Because you didn't have this level of traffic feeding through the system before," he said. "You scaled up, but your model didn't adjust the way it should have." Daniel frowned. "That's not how it works. The model adapts dynamically." Ethan gave a small shake of his head. "Only within the parameters you gave it." Another silence. Clara leaned back slightly, processing. "So you're saying the system isn't broken," she said slowly. "It's misaligned." "Exactly." Daniel's grip tightened on his tablet. "We built those parameters based on months of data, and that data didn't include this kind of load," Ethan said. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're telling me our biggest expansion just exposed a flaw we didn't account for?" Ethan met his gaze. "Yeah. No hesitation. No softening. Just the truth. The kind that didn't care about titles." Daniel let out a frustrated breath. "Even if that's true, we can recalibrate." "It's not." The screen flickered again. A sharp pulse of red, smaller than before, but sudden, unpredictable. Clara leaned forward immediately. "What was that?" Daniel's fingers moved fast. Minor fluctuation. Ethan was already shaking his head. "No. That's it starting again." Marcus turned sharply. "We're still in manual mode." "Doesn't matter," Ethan said. "Residual pressure. You didn't clear all the congestion. It's going to keep pushing back until you do." Daniel stared at the data, something like disbelief creeping in. "That doesn't make sense." Ethan stepped closer to the screen now, just enough to point again. "You've still got overlapping routes feeding into that sector. You separated the main corridors, but not the secondary feeds." Daniel followed his gesture. His expression changed, subtly, but undeniably. "There," he said under his breath. Clara caught it. "You missed that?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Marcus's gaze shifted between them, then back to Ethan. The dynamic in the room had shifted again, not completely, but enough that no one was laughing anymore. No one was dismissing him. "Fix it," Marcus said. He wasn't talking to Daniel. Ethan didn't react to the authority in the command. He just looked at the screen, already mapping the solution in his head. You need to stagger those secondary feeds, he said. Don't reroute them all at once. Phase them, 10-second intervals. Let the system breathe between adjustments. Daniel hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second this time. Then he followed the instruction. The system responded. The red flickered, paused, and then again began to shrink. More steadily this time, more completely. Clara exhaled slowly. That's stabilizing faster. Daniel nodded, though his expression was tight. Yeah, Marcus didn't look at the screen anymore. He looked at Ethan. Really looked at him. Not as a janitor, not as an interruption, as a variable he hadn't accounted for. You've done this before, Marcus said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ethan's eyes stayed on the display. Something like it, that's not an answer. Ethan glanced at him. It's the only one you're getting right now. Another beat. Marcus didn't push, not yet, because something else was becoming clear. This wasn't luck. It wasn't guesswork. It wasn't coincidence. It was expertise. And it didn't belong in a uniform like that. Across the room, the final traces of red faded into neutral tones. The system stabilized fully. No more spikes. No more pulses. Daniel leaned back slightly, tension finally releasing from his shoulders. Backlog's clearing, he said. We're good. Clara nodded, eyes still on the screen. For now, but Marcus didn't move, didn't speak, because the real problem in that room wasn't the system anymore. It was the man standing beside it, the one they had laughed at, the one they had dismissed, the one who had just saved them from a disaster they didn't even fully understand. And Marcus knew, instinctively, uncomfortably, that this wasn't over. Not even close. The room didn't return to normal. Not after something like that. The screen still displayed clean data, steady flow, balanced routes, no flashing warnings, but the tension hadn't disappeared with the red. It had shifted, settled into something quieter, sharper. Marcus slowly took his seat again, though the authority in the gesture felt different now, less automatic, more deliberate. All right, he said, voice controlled, system stable. For now, no one responded immediately, because everyone knew what that for now meant. Clara broke the silence. We need to understand how this happened before we proceed with the rollout, she said, her tone measured but firm. If the model can misread load at this scale, we're exposed. Daniel nodded, though it looked more like obligation than agreement. We'll run diagnostics, adjust parameters. That's not enough, Clara cut in. We didn't just miss a fluctuation, we misread a pattern. Her eyes shifted. To him. Ethan hadn't moved from the screen. He stood slightly off to the side, hands resting loosely at his sides now, like he'd already stepped out of whatever role he'd been forced into. Marcus followed Clara's gaze. And for a moment, the CEO didn't say anything. Then you, he said, not dismissive this time. Direct. Stay. A few of the executives exchanged glances. The janitor, staying in the boardroom, but no one challenged it. Not anymore. Ethan gave a small nod. Not agreement. Not submission. Just acknowledgement. Daniel cleared his throat. Marcus, with all due respect, we can handle this internally. We don't need... Marcus raised a hand. Daniel stopped. We're not ignoring the one person in this room who saw it before anyone else, Marcus said. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. Clara leaned forward slightly. You said you've seen this before, she said, addressing Ethan directly now. Where? A simple question. But the room leaned into it. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved across the screen one last time, confirming what he already knew the system was holding. For now. Then he looked back at Clara. Different system, he said. Same kind of mistake. Daniel exhaled in frustration. That's vague. It's accurate. Marcus leaned back slightly, studying him again. You're not just noticing patterns, he said. You're predicting behavior. Ethan didn't respond. Marcus's eyes narrowed just a fraction. That level of insight doesn't come from cleaning floors. There it was. Not an insult this time, an observation, a challenge. Ethan held his gaze. No, he said simply. Silence. Not awkward, not tense, just waiting. Clara's voice softened slightly. Then where does it come from? Ethan hesitated. Not because he didn't have an answer, because he was deciding whether to give it. Before he could, the screen flickered again, a sharp, sudden pulse. Not red this time. Yellow. Warning level. Daniel's head snapped back toward his tablet. What now? Clara straightened. That's a different sector. Marcus stood again, faster this time. I thought we stabilized it. Ethan was already moving, not rushed, not panicked, just ahead. That's residual imbalance, he said, eyes locking on to the new fluctuation. You cleared the primary congestion, but the pressure shifted sideways. Daniel's fingers flew across his tablet. It's minor, we can contain. The yellow spiked. Briefly, but enough to matter. Clara's voice cut in. That's not minor. Ethan stepped closer to the console, his focus narrowing. You didn't redistribute evenly, he said. You relieved one bottleneck and created stress somewhere else. Daniel shook his head. That's not. He stopped. Because the data in front of him said otherwise. Marcus didn't look at Daniel this time. He looked at Ethan. Tell us what to do, he said. Not a suggestion. Not a reluctant acceptance, a decision. The shift in the room was undeniable now. Ethan didn't hesitate. You need to balance the load across all secondary routes, he said, not just the ones that are failing. If you only react to the spikes, you'll keep chasing the problem instead of fixing it. Daniel swallowed. That would require recalculating distribution across the entire network in real time. That's possible, Ethan finished. If you simplify the variables, Clara frowned slightly. Simplify how? Strip out the non-essential modifiers, Ethan said. Focus on capacity and flow, nothing else. Daniel stared at him. That would reduce efficiency. It'll keep your system from breaking, Ethan replied. Another pause. Marcus didn't look away from Ethan. Do it, he said. Daniel hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. Then he executed. The system shifted again. Data streams recalibrated. Routes adjusted, not aggressively this time, but evenly, carefully. The yellow flickered, held, and then faded, gone. A deeper silence followed, not the kind filled with tension, the kind filled with realization. Clara leaned back slowly. That wasn't luck. Daniel didn't speak. Because he couldn't. Marcus exhaled, long and controlled. Then he looked at Ethan. Really looked this time. You're not a janitor, he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan's expression didn't change. I clean floors, he said. Marcus almost smiled. Not amused, not impressed, just recognizing something. Yeah, he said quietly. But that's not all you do. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone in that room understood something they hadn't before. The uniform, the cart, the quiet presence. None of it explained the man standing in front of them, and whatever he wasn't saying, it mattered. Marcus straightened slightly, his voice shifting again, less confrontational, more intentional. We're not done here, he said. Ethan met his gaze. I know. And for the first time since he'd walked into that room, it didn't sound like he was the one out of place. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was pressure. Not from the system anymore, but from the realization settling into every corner of that boardroom. The crisis hadn't just exposed a flaw in their network. It had exposed something far more uncomfortable. They hadn't been the smartest people in the room. Marcus didn't sit back down this time. He remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the table, eyes fixed on the man who had just dismantled their assumptions without raising his voice. "All right," he said slowly, "we stabilized it twice. That doesn't mean it won't happen again." Ethan gave a small nod. "It will, no hesitation. No attempt to soften it." Daniel let out a breath, frustration creeping back in. "You're assuming worst-case scenarios again." Ethan shook his head. "I'm recognizing patterns." Clara leaned forward slightly. "If it happens again, how bad are we talking?" Ethan glanced at the screen, then back at her. "Worse than what you just saw," he said, "because next time, it won't be gradual." That landed. Marcus's expression hardened. "Explain." Ethan stepped closer to the display, his finger hovering just above the surface without touching it. "Right now, your system's still holding because we interrupted the cascade early," he said. "But the underlying flaw's still there. The model's still misreading pressure points." Daniel crossed his arms. "We can recalibrate that. Not fast enough," Ethan replied. The words were quiet, but they hit harder than anything else he'd said so far. Clara's voice dropped slightly. "What happens if we don't?" Ethan didn't look away from the screen. "Then it doesn't bottleneck," he said. Marcus frowned. "What does it do?" Ethan finally turned back to them. "It collapses." The word hung in the air. No one spoke, because everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant. Not delays, not inefficiencies, collapse. The kind that didn't just affect numbers on a screen, but contracts, reputation, entire supply chains. Daniel shook his head, but it wasn't confident anymore. "That's extreme." Ethan met his gaze. "So is your load?" Another silence. He wasn't arguing. He was stating facts. And that made it impossible to ignore. Marcus exhaled slowly, tension settling deeper into his posture. "Then we fix the flaw," he said. "Now." Daniel nodded quickly. "We'll bring in the engineering team. Run a full diagnostic." "They won't see it," Ethan interrupted. That stopped him. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why not?" Ethan's voice remained calm. "Because they're looking at the system the way it was designed," he said, "not the way it's behaving under pressure." Clara studied him carefully. "And you are?" Ethan shrugged slightly. "I've seen what happens when systems get pushed past what they were built for." Daniel scoffed, but it sounded weaker this time. "You keep saying that like you've—" "Daniel," Marcus cut in, not sharply, but firmly enough to end it. Daniel fell silent. Marcus stepped closer, closing the distance between himself and Ethan by just a few feet. Not aggressive, not confrontational. Focused. "You're speaking like someone who's managed operations at scale," Marcus said. "Not someone who cleans offices after hours." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked briefly toward the door, toward the hallway beyond it, like part of him was already somewhere else. Then he looked back. "I know what failure looks like," he said. That wasn't an answer. But it wasn't nothing. Clara caught it. So did Marcus. Daniel didn't. "Everyone knows what failure looks like," Daniel muttered. "That doesn't make you an expert." Ethan didn't react, didn't defend himself, didn't argue, because he didn't need to. The screen behind them flickered again. Not red, not yellow, but something new, a thin line of orange stretching across a different sector of the network. Smaller, quieter, but unmistakably there. Clara's voice sharpened. "That's a new region." Daniel turned quickly. It shouldn't be affected. Ethan was already watching it. Of course it was. Same pattern, he said. Marcus didn't look at the screen. He looked at Ethan. "What do we do?" There was no hesitation this time, no debate, no dismissal, just a question. Ethan stepped forward, fully now, past the invisible line that had separated him from the table before. "You don't chase it," he said. "You get ahead of it." Daniel frowned. "That's not specific." Ethan's gaze stayed locked on the data. "You need to shut down predictive routing completely." Across the entire network, Daniel's head snapped toward him. "That's not an option. It is if you don't want this spreading," Ethan replied. Clara's brow furrowed. "That would cripple efficiency across every sector." Ethan nodded. Temporarily, Daniel shook his head harder now. "No, that's too risky. We'd lose. You're about to lose more," Ethan said. Calm, unshaken, Marcus watched him closely, every word, every movement, weighing it, measuring it. Because the stakes had changed. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a decision point. Before we go further, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next forces a choice that could cost them everything. Marcus exhaled slowly, then turned to Daniel. "If we don't do this," he said, "what's our alternative?" Daniel hesitated. "Just for a second. Then, we try to contain each sector as it spikes." Marcus nodded slightly, then looked back at Ethan. "And your option?" Ethan didn't blink. "You stop it before it spreads. 2 paths. One safe. One decisive." The room held its breath. Because whatever happened next, there was no going back. The room didn't move. Not immediately. 2 options hung in the air like opposing weights, one built on control, the other on trust. And for the first time since the meeting began, Marcus wasn't deciding between ideas. He was deciding between people. Daniel straightened, voice firm despite the tension tightening around him. "We don't shut down the entire predictive system based on a theory," he said. "We isolate, contain, and correct. That's how this is designed to work." Ethan didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the screen, tracking the thin orange line as it stretched further across the network. "It's not a theory," he said quietly. "It's already happening." Clara's gaze moved between them. "If we follow Daniel's approach," she said carefully, "we're reacting to each failure as it appears. And if you follow mine," Ethan added, "you stop the failures from appearing at all." Daniel scoffed. "That's not how complex systems behave." Ethan finally turned to him. "Not confrontational, just direct. That's exactly how they behave when the model driving them is wrong." The words landed harder than anything else he'd said. Because they weren't about the system. They were about the people who built it. Marcus felt that shift. He stepped forward again, closing the distance between himself and the table. "If we shut down predictive routing," he said, "how long before we lose control of the network entirely?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "You won't if you manage it properly." Daniel let out a sharp breath. "That's not an answer. It is," Ethan replied. "You're assuming control only exists inside your model. It doesn't." Clara leaned in slightly. "Then where does it exist?" Ethan glanced at her. "In the people running it." Silence. That answer wasn't technical. It was fundamental. And it made Daniel visibly uncomfortable. "We can't run a system of this scale manually," Daniel argued. "Not without losing efficiency, not without trusting your team," Ethan finished. Daniel stopped. Because that wasn't where he was going. But it was where the conversation had landed. The orange line on the screen pulsed again. Wider this time. Not aggressively, but steadily. Marcus noticed it. "Of course he did. Time's not on our side," he said. Clara nodded once. "It's spreading." Daniel's fingers hovered over his tablet, ready to execute his containment protocols. "We can handle this," he insisted. "We've trained for." "You've trained for the system working," Ethan interrupted. "Not for it failing like this, another beat." Marcus turned fully toward him. "If we do this your way," he said, "what's the first step?" Ethan stepped closer to the console again, his presence now fully integrated into the space that had rejected him minutes ago. "You don't just shut it off," he said. "You transition." Daniel frowned. "Transition how?" Ethan pointed to the screen. "You stagger the shutdown across sectors. Don't kill the model all at once, phase it out while you bring manual control online." Clara's eyes sharpened. "That would prevent shock to the system." "Exactly." Daniel hesitated, because that made sense, and he hated that it did. Marcus caught it, that hesitation, that shift, and it told him everything he needed to know. "Do it," Marcus said. Daniel looked at him. "Marcus, that wasn't a suggestion." The room went still again. Then, slowly, Daniel executed the first command. The system responded. The predictive layer dimmed slightly in one sector, replaced by manual routing controls. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, the orange line stopped growing, not shrinking, but not spreading. Clara exhaled softly, its holding. Ethan nodded once. "Now move to the next sector." Daniel followed. Another adjustment, another shift. The predictive layer faded further. The orange line flickered, and then it began to shrink, slowly, but undeniably. The room felt it. That shift, that turning point. Marcus didn't look at the screen this time. He looked at Ethan. Because this wasn't just problem-solving anymore. This was command, not given, taken, without force, without authority, just through competence. "Where did you learn this?" Marcus asked. The question wasn't casual. It wasn't curious. It was pointed. Because there was no way someone without experience at this level could do what he was doing. Ethan didn't answer right away. His focus remained on the system as Daniel continued phasing out predictive routing across the network. Sector by sector. Control returning. Stability spreading. Only when the orange line had almost completely disappeared did he speak. "Somewhere that didn't give second chances," he said. Clara's gaze sharpened. Marcus's expression shifted, subtle but real. Daniel paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing his inputs. Because that answer? It wasn't random, it was history. And it didn't belong to a janitor. The final traces of orange faded from the screen. The system stabilized again, fully this time. No warnings, no spikes, just clean, balanced flow. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling as the tension drained from his shoulders. "Network stable," he said, "across all sectors." Clara nodded slowly, and holding, Marcus remained still, silent, processing, because the crisis had just been solved, again. But the real question, the one no one had answered yet, was still sitting in the middle of that room. Who was he? Marcus turned to Ethan once more. This time, there was no arrogance left, no dismissal, just something sharper, something more dangerous, recognition, and a need for the truth. "We're not done talking," Marcus said quietly. Ethan met his gaze. "I didn't think we were." And for the first time since this began, it wasn't the CEO controlling the room anymore. The system was quiet. Too quiet. No alerts, no flashing indicators, no sudden spikes crawling across the network. Just clean data, smooth, balanced, exactly the way it was supposed to look. But no one relaxed. Because now that the crisis was under control, something else had taken its place. Questions. Marcus remained standing at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on Ethan, not with authority, but with intent. The kind that didn't let things go unanswered. "Everyone out," Marcus said suddenly. The words landed with precision. Daniel looked up immediately. "Marcus, we still need to." I said out. No raise in volume, no argument, just finality. Clara hesitated for a second, studying Marcus, then Ethan. Something unreadable passed through her expression before she closed her tablet and stood. One by one, the others followed. Chairs shifted, papers gathered. Quiet footsteps moved toward the door. No one protested. Because they all understood this wasn't about the system anymore. It was about him. The door closed softly behind the last executive. Silence settled in again. But this time it was different. Smaller, more focused. Just the two of them now, standing in a room that had completely changed in less than an hour. Marcus didn't move right away. He let the quiet stretch like he was measuring it. Then, "You're not telling me something." It wasn't accusatory. It was certain. Ethan leaned lightly against the edge of the console, arms relaxed at his sides. "There's a lot I'm not telling you." Marcus almost smiled at that, almost. "Let's start simple," he said. "You walk into my boardroom, you predict a system failure my entire executive team missed, and then you fix it. Twice." He paused. "That doesn't happen by accident, no." Ethan agreed. Marcus took a step closer. "So tell me how it happens." Ethan's eyes drifted briefly to the screen again, confirming what he already knew. The system was still holding. Then back to Marcus. "You ever seen a system fail in real time?" he asked. Marcus frowned slightly. "I just did." Ethan shook his head. "No. You saw a version of it. Controlled. Contained." His voice remained calm, but there was something deeper in it now. "I'm talking about when failure doesn't stop at numbers, when it spreads and people don't get a chance to fix it." Marcus studied him carefully. "You're not talking about corporate logistics." Ethan didn't answer. But he didn't need to. The implication was clear. Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture shifting, not defensive, not aggressive, just recalibrating. "Military?" he asked. Ethan's expression didn't change. "That's one way to describe it." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not an answer. It's enough of one." Another pause. Marcus wasn't used to this. Not having control of the conversation. Not being the one asking questions that got clear answers. But he adapted quickly. "What were you?" he asked. Ethan's gaze held steady. "For a long time," he said, "I was the guy people called when things stopped working the way they were supposed to." Marcus absorbed that. "Operations," he said. "High level." Ethan didn't confirm it. But he didn't deny it either. Marcus let out a quiet breath, running a hand briefly along the edge of the table. "And now you're cleaning floors in my building, yeah." The simplicity of the answer hit harder than anything else. Marcus looked at him again, differently this time. Not as a mystery, as a contradiction. "That doesn't make sense," Marcus said. Ethan gave a small shrug. "It doesn't have to." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "It does to me." Ethan's eyes softened, just a fraction. "That's because you're used to things lining up," he said. "Titles matching roles. People being where they're supposed to be, and you're not where you're supposed to be?" Ethan didn't answer right away. For the first time, there was a flicker of something else behind his calm. Not discomfort, not regret, something quieter, more personal. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said finally. Marcus caught it. That shift. "Because of your daughter," he said. It wasn't a guess, it was an observation. Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly. Marcus nodded once. "You mentioned timing earlier. Patterns. That kind of thinking, it doesn't just disappear." He paused. "So something made you step away." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then, yeah, Marcus waited. But Ethan didn't continue. And this time, Marcus didn't push. Not because he wasn't curious, because he understood something had boundaries. The room fell quiet again. But not tense, just real. Marcus finally stepped back slightly, breaking the intensity of the moment. "You know," he said, "if anyone else had walked in here and said what you said, they'd be out of the building by now." Ethan gave a faint nod. "I figured, and yet you stayed." Ethan's voice was steady. You needed someone too. Marcus let out a short breath, something close to a laugh but not quite. You're not wrong. Another pause. Then Marcus's expression shifted again. Focused. Strategic. The system's stable now, he said. But you said the flaw's still there. It is. So we fix it. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Marcus studied him for a second longer. Then you're going to help us do that, not a question. A decision. Ethan didn't react immediately. His eyes moved once more to the screen. Then back to Marcus. I'll show you where it breaks, he said. Marcus nodded slowly. That's all I need. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Because whatever this man wasn't saying yet, it was bigger than a broken system. And it was about to come out. The room didn't feel like a boardroom anymore. It felt like a command center. Not because the screens had changed, but because the control had. Marcus moved first, pulling a chair slightly back from the table. Sit, he said, gesturing toward it. It wasn't a gesture of courtesy, it was recognition. Ethan glanced at the chair, then back at the screens. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse. Then he stepped forward and sat, not like someone stepping up, but like someone stepping back into something familiar. Daniel hadn't left. He stood near the far side of the table, arms crossed tightly, watching everything unfold with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. We're really doing this? He muttered. Handing control to. Marcus didn't even look at him this time. We're fixing the system, he said. You can either help, or you can watch. That shut him up. Clara remained seated as well, her tablet open, eyes sharp and observant. She wasn't skeptical anymore, she was studying. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his focus narrowing as the system maps expanded across the central display. Bring up the full network architecture, he said. Daniel hesitated, just long enough. Then complied. Layers unfolded across the screen, routes, nodes, data flows, predictive overlays still dimmed from the earlier shutdown. Ethan studied it in silence, not scanning, reading. You built this to be efficient, he said after a moment. Daniel frowned. Of course we did. Ethan nodded. That's the problem. Clara tilted her head slightly. Efficiency is the goal, not when it removes flexibility, Ethan replied. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Explain. Ethan pointed to a cluster of nodes. You've centralized too much control into the predictive layer. It's making decisions faster than your system can adapt when those decisions are wrong. Daniel shook his head. That's the entire point of predictive modeling, to stay ahead, yeah, Ethan said. When it works, another pause. Clara tapped her screen thoughtfully. So when it fails everywhere, Ethan nodded. Exactly. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Then what's the fix? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted the display, pulling up a different view. One that stripped away some of the complexity, leaving behind something more raw. Decentralized control, he said. Daniel let out a short laugh. That would undo half the system. It would stabilize it, Ethan replied. Clara leaned in. How? Ethan pointed again. You create independent control pockets, smaller zones that can operate without relying entirely on the predictive model. That way, if one fails, it doesn't take everything else with it. Daniel frowned. That reduces optimization, it increases survivability, Ethan said. The word hung there, not corporate, not polished, but accurate. Marcus caught it immediately. Survivability, he repeated. Ethan nodded once. Marcus leaned back slightly, processing. You're not talking like an engineer. Ethan didn't respond. Clara's eyes flicked between them. He's talking like someone who's seen systems collapse. Daniel crossed his arms tighter. We don't design for collapse. We design to prevent it. Ethan looked at him. Calm. Direct. You design to avoid it, he said. That's not the same thing. Silence. Marcus exhaled slowly. If we implement this, how long? Ethan glanced at the system. Not long if you focus on the critical sectors first. You don't rebuild everything, you reinforce the weak points. Clara nodded slightly. Targeted restructuring. Daniel shook his head again. This is a complete shift in architecture. We can, Marcus cut in. Daniel stopped. Because Marcus's tone had changed. Not questioning. Deciding. Marcus turned back to Ethan. You'll map it out. Ethan met his gaze. I'll show you where to start. Another pause. Then, Marcus nodded. That's enough. Clara began typing rapidly, already translating the approach into actionable steps. We'll need to isolate the highest risk sectors first, she said. Reassign control protocols. Start with the West Corridor, Ethan added. That's where it began. The flaw's deepest there. Daniel let out a quiet breath, tension still visible in every line of his posture. But he didn't argue. Not this time. Because he couldn't. The results were already in front of him. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, his eyes still on the screen, but his expression had shifted. Not tense, not focused in the same way as before. This wasn't crisis anymore, this was strategy. And it showed. Marcus noticed. Of course he did. You've done this before, he said again. Not asking, confirming. Ethan didn't look at him this time. Yeah, he said quietly. Marcus studied him for a moment longer. Then, at this level, Ethan's gaze stayed forward. Higher, that landed. Harder than anything else so far. Clara paused mid-typing, eyes lifting slightly. Daniel froze completely. And Marcus didn't react outwardly. But something inside that calculation shifted. Because this wasn't just expertise anymore. This was something else. Something they hadn't even begun to understand. Before we go further, subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next reveals the truth they never saw coming. Marcus straightened slightly, his voice quieter now, but sharper. Why are you here? The question cut through everything else, not about the system, not about the crisis, about him. Ethan finally looked at him. Really looked this time. And for the first time, there was no deflection, no redirection. Just truth. Waiting at the edge. Because I had to be, he said. And somehow, that answer changed everything. The words didn't echo. They settled. Because I had to be. No one spoke for a moment after that. Not Marcus, not Clara, not even Daniel, who had finally stopped trying to push back. The system continued running smoothly in the background, but the real tension in the room had nothing to do with data anymore. It was about the man sitting in that chair. Marcus stepped closer, slower this time, not to assert control, but to understand it. That's not a corporate answer, he said quietly. Ethan's gaze didn't move from him. I'm not a corporate guy. That much is obvious. Clara shifted slightly in her seat, her attention no longer divided between the system and the conversation. You said earlier, somewhere that didn't give second chances, she added. What does that mean? Ethan exhaled softly. Not tired, just deciding. For a long time, he said, I worked in places where failure didn't show up as numbers on a screen. It showed up as people not making it home. The room went still, even Daniel. Because that wasn't a metaphor. Marcus's expression tightened slightly. Military logistics, he said. Field operations. Ethan didn't correct him. But he didn't fully confirm it either. Close enough. Clara's voice softened. And you left that to do this? Ethan's eyes flicked briefly toward the door again, toward the world outside this room, then back. I didn't leave because I wanted to, he said. Marcus caught the shift. What happened? Another pause, longer this time. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, his posture still relaxed, but his eyes were different now. Not distant, not guarded, just carrying something. I missed something once, he said. The simplicity of it made it heavier. Daniel frowned slightly. You missed something? Ethan nodded. A pattern, small one. Looked harmless. The room held still. Because they all knew what came next. It wasn't. No one asked what happened after that. They didn't need to. It was already written in the way he said it. Clara lowered her gaze slightly, processing. Marcus didn't move at all, and Daniel didn't speak. For the first time since this began, he didn't have a response. Ethan looked back at the screen, watching the system flow cleanly again. Systems don't fail all at once, he said. They fail in pieces, quietly. Until no one can stop it. Marcus exhaled slowly. And you learn to see those pieces before they connect. Ethan nodded once. Or you don't get another chance. Silence settled again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. Clara broke it first, so you stepped away. Ethan shook his head slightly. I stepped out. Difference? Marcus asked. Ethan's expression softened, just a fraction. I had someone who needed me to, he said. Marcus nodded once. The daughter, Ethan didn't say her name. But he didn't need to. Daniel shifted slightly, the tension in his posture easing for the first time. So you went from that, he gestured vaguely, to this? Ethan glanced at him. Yeah, Daniel frowned. That doesn't track. Ethan gave a faint, almost tired smile. It doesn't have to. Marcus studied him again, deeper this time. You're overqualified for this building, he said. Ethan shrugged slightly. It pays the bills. That's not why you stayed, Marcus replied. Ethan didn't answer. Because Marcus was right. Clara noticed it too. You stayed because it's stable, she said quietly. Predictable. No variables you can't control. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time, he nodded. Yeah, that landed differently. Because now it made sense. The uniform. The silence. The decision to stay invisible. It wasn't about lack of opportunity, it was about control. Marcus exhaled slowly, turning slightly toward the screen before looking back. And yet, you stepped in anyway. Ethan's gaze followed his, then returned. Because this wasn't just a system problem. Marcus tilted his head slightly. What was it? Ethan didn't hesitate. It was the same mistake, he said. Just in a different place. Another quiet pause. Clara leaned back, her expression thoughtful. So what we're building here, it's vulnerable, Ethan nodded. Yeah. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was different now. Less defensive, more grounded. And the changes you're suggesting, they fix that? They reduce the risk, Ethan said. Nothing removes it completely. Marcus stepped forward again, his focus sharpening. Then we reduce it as much as we can. Ethan nodded once. That's the job. The room shifted again. Not in tension. In alignment. For the first time since the meeting began, they weren't arguing. They were working. Clara turned back to her tablet. We'll need to restructure the network in phases, she said. Prioritize high-risk sectors, build independent control pockets. Start with the West Corridor, Ethan added again, then expand outward. Daniel nodded slowly, already adjusting parameters. We can isolate those sectors within the hour. Marcus looked between them. Then, back at Ethan. You're staying on this, he said, not a question. Ethan met his gaze. For now, Marcus accepted that. Because for now, that was enough. But as the system maps continued to shift and the restructuring began, one thing was becoming clearer with every passing second. This wasn't just about fixing a flaw. It was about rebuilding something that had never been as strong as they thought. And the man guiding them through it was the one they had almost thrown out of the room. The transformation didn't happen with noise. It happened with precision. Across the massive display, sectors began shifting, subtle at first, then more defined. Control pockets formed where there had once been a single, centralized command. Routes adjusted, not aggressively but intelligently. Balanced. Alive. Clara moved quickly, her fingers gliding across the tablet as she coordinated changes across departments. The west corridor is isolated, she said, secondary sectors adjusting now. Daniel stood beside her, no longer resisting, just working. Load distribution stabilizing across the first 3 zones, he added. We're not seeing any pressure spikes. Ethan remained seated, watching it all unfold with quiet focus, not directing every move, just guiding it. Don't rush the transitions, he said. If you move too fast, you'll create the same imbalance we just fixed. Clara nodded immediately. Understood. Marcus stood slightly behind them, silent, observing. The room felt different now, not hierarchical, not rigid. It moved around competence, not titles. And that shift? It was permanent. The system continued to evolve in real time. Sector by sector, the network adapted, not just reacting, but stabilizing in a way it hadn't before. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. We're seeing consistent balance across all modified zones, he said. No residual pressure. Clara glanced at Ethan. That's what you expected? Ethan gave a small nod. Yeah. Once you take away the false signals, the system corrects itself. Marcus stepped forward slightly. And the rest? Ethan looked at the untouched sections of the network. Same process, he said. Just takes time. Daniel exhaled slowly, tension finally giving way to something else. We built this to be efficient, he said. Didn't think we were building something fragile. Ethan's gaze stayed on the screen. Most systems don't look fragile until they're pushed. Clara leaned back slightly, studying the changes. This isn't just a fix, she said. It's a redesign. Marcus nodded once. A necessary one. The last unmodified sector came into view, still operating under the old predictive model. Clean on the surface, but now, after everything they'd seen, no one trusted it. Daniel hesitated for a moment before initiating the final transition. Last sector, he said. Ethan watched carefully. Stagger it, he reminded. Daniel nodded. I know. The command executed. The predictive layer dimmed. Manual control phased in. For a moment, nothing. Then a brief flicker of yellow. Clara straightened. There it is, Daniel's fingers hovered. We can adjust. Wait, Ethan said. Daniel froze. Everyone did. The yellow flickered again, smaller this time, weaker. Then it disappeared, gone. The system settled. Completely. No warnings, no fluctuations, just balance. Daniel leaned back slowly, his voice quieter than before. That's it, he said. Full network stabilized. Clara nodded, eyes still scanning for any sign of instability, and holding. Marcus didn't look at the screen. He looked at Ethan. Because the system wasn't the most important thing in that room anymore, you just rebuilt my entire network, Marcus said. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, you did. Marcus's expression shifted, almost amused, but not quite. Don't do that, he said. You know exactly what you did. Ethan didn't argue. Because there was nothing to argue. Daniel glanced over at him, something new in his expression, not frustration, not skepticism. Respect, reluctant, but real. You saw all of that in minutes, Daniel said. Things we've been working on for months. Ethan shrugged slightly. Different perspective. Clara studied him carefully. That's more than perspective. Ethan didn't respond. Marcus stepped closer, his voice lowering slightly. You said earlier you missed something once, he said. A pattern. Ethan's gaze didn't move. Marcus continued. You didn't miss this one. A quiet pause. Ethan finally spoke. No, Marcus nodded slowly. Good. The room fell into a different kind of silence. Not tense, not uncertain. Resolved. The crisis was over. The system was stable. The solution had been implemented. But something else remained. Marcus turned slightly, glancing at the door, then back at Ethan. "You could have walked out earlier," he said, "after we fixed the first issue. No one would have stopped you." Ethan nodded. "Yeah. But you didn't." Ethan's voice stayed calm. It wasn't done. Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he did something no one in that room expected. He extended his hand, not as a CEO, not as a gesture of power, as acknowledgement. Ethan looked at it, just for a second, then he stood, and shook it, firm, simple, equal. Daniel watched it happen, the shift settling in fully now. Clara allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. Because that moment, that quiet, unspoken exchange, said more than anything else could. The man they had laughed at had just saved them, and the system they thought they controlled had just taught them something else entirely. Power didn't come from position. It came from knowing what to do when everything else failed. The handshake didn't last long. It didn't need to, because what passed between them wasn't about agreement. It was recognition. Marcus let go first, but his posture didn't return to what it had been before. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in how he saw the man in front of him, but in how he understood the room itself. For a moment, no one spoke. The system continued running smoothly behind them, a quiet reminder of what had just been prevented. Daniel broke the silence first, clearing his throat. "We should document the changes," he said, his tone measured now. "Update protocols. Inform the regional teams." Clara nodded. "Agreed, and we'll need to revise the predictive model entirely before we even consider reactivating it." Marcus didn't look at them. His focus remained on Ethan. "You're not going back to cleaning floors tonight," Marcus said. It wasn't framed as an offer, it sounded like a decision. Ethan didn't react immediately. His eyes drifted briefly toward the hallway again, the same quiet exit he'd used every night, the same path that led back to a life built on stability, not recognition. "I've got a shift," he said simply. Marcus exhaled through his nose, almost amused, but not dismissive. "You just saved this company from a collapse that would have cost us more than most people make in a lifetime," he said. "I think we can cover your shift." Ethan's gaze returned to him. "That's not the point." Clara watched that exchange closely, her expression thoughtful. "Then what is?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. "Because the answer wasn't something you said quickly. It's consistent," he said finally. "It's predictable." Daniel frowned slightly. "You're talking about mopping floors like it's a strategy." Ethan looked at him. "It is." That shut him up. Marcus studied him again, more carefully than before. "You built your life around control," he said. After losing it once, Ethan didn't deny it. Clara's voice softened. "And stepping back into something like this that risks everything you've built." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah." The room went quiet again. Because now they understood something they hadn't before. This wasn't about capability, it was about choice. Marcus turned slightly, pacing a single step before stopping again. "I'm going to offer you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it fully before you decide." Ethan didn't move. Marcus continued. "You come in here tomorrow, not as a janitor, as a consultant. You help us rebuild this system properly. You train the team. You make sure this doesn't happen again." Daniel blinked slightly at that but didn't interrupt. Clara didn't look surprised. She looked like she'd been expecting it. Marcus's voice stayed steady. "You set your terms, hours, scope. Whatever you need, a pause. Then, and you get paid like someone who actually knows what they're doing, silence, not awkward, just heavy. Ethan leaned back slightly against the edge of the table, his arms resting loosely at his sides. He didn't look tempted. He looked thoughtful. "I've heard offers like that before," he said. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "And?" "I said no." Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost under it. "Of course you did." Clara ignored him, her attention still on Ethan. "Why?" Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then lifted again. "Because it pulls you back in," he said. "Once you step into it again, it doesn't stay contained." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're afraid of that?" Ethan didn't react to the word, but he didn't reject it either. "I'm careful with it," he said instead. Another pause. Marcus considered that. Then, what if it doesn't have to be all or nothing? Ethan looked at him. Marcus stepped closer again, not imposing, just present. "What if you help us fix this, on your terms?" he said. "No long-term commitment. No full return to whatever you walked away from." Clara added quietly, "You control the boundaries." Daniel shifted slightly but said nothing. Because this made sense. Ethan was silent for a long moment. The room didn't rush him. Because everyone there understood, this decision wasn't about money or status. It was about what kind of life he was willing to risk again. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I've got a daughter," he said. Marcus nodded once. "I know, she comes first, understood." Ethan's gaze stayed steady. "That doesn't change, it won't." Another pause. Then, "All right," Ethan said. The word landed quietly. But it changed everything. Daniel blinked. "Wait, seriously?" Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. Marcus didn't smile. But something in his expression settled. "Good," he said. Ethan pushed himself off the table, straightening slightly. "Temporary," he added. Marcus nodded. Temporary. They both knew what that meant. Not a promise, not a guarantee, just a start. The room shifted one last time. Not in tension, not in uncertainty, but in something steadier. Respect. Real. Earned. Marcus turned slightly toward the door. "We'll get you set up in the morning," he said. "Access, workspace, whatever you need." Ethan nodded once. Then, without ceremony, he turned toward the exit. Back toward the hallway. Back toward the life he'd built. But this time, he wasn't walking away unnoticed, and everyone in that room knew it. The man they had dismissed as a janitor had just become the one person they couldn't afford to overlook again. The hallway felt quieter than usual. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The same polished floors stretched ahead. The same hum of distant machinery echoed through the building. The same cleaning cart waited where he'd left it, untouched, exactly as it had been before everything shifted. Ethan walked toward it slowly. Not rushed, not distracted, just steady, like nothing had changed. But everything had. He reached the cart, resting his hand lightly on the handle for a moment. The familiar weight grounded him, the simplicity of it, the routine, the predictability he had built his life around. For a second, he just stood there. Then he exhaled and moved. The wheels rolled quietly against the floor as he pushed the cart forward, back into the corridors where no one expected anything from him, where no one asked questions, where everything stayed manageable. Until, "Dad," the voice came fast, light, bright, and it cut through everything else. Ethan turned. Lily ran toward him from the far end of the hallway, her small backpack bouncing slightly against her shoulders. She wasn't supposed to be here this late, but that didn't matter in that moment. He set the cart aside just in time to catch her as she reached him. "You're still working," she said, slightly out of breath, looking up at him. He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yeah," he said. "Just finishing up?" She glanced past him toward the direction of the boardroom. "There were a lot of people up there," she said. Everything okay? Ethan followed her gaze for a moment. Then back to her. Yeah, he said quietly. It is now. She studied him for a second, longer than most kids would, like she understood more than she said. Then she smiled. Good. He picked up the cart again, one hand on the handle, the other resting lightly on her shoulder as they walked together down the corridor. Simple. Quiet. Steady. Behind them, inside that boardroom, things were already moving. Clara was coordinating teams. Daniel was rewriting protocols. Marcus stood at the window, looking out over the city, not at the skyline, but at the reflection in the glass, because for the first time in a long time, he had misjudged something. No, someone. And that realization didn't sit lightly. The janitor he had questioned had seen what no one else could, had done what no one else could, and had walked away from it without asking for anything in return. That part stayed with him the most. Because power, real power, didn't need to announce itself. It just acted. And it didn't care who noticed. Back in the hallway, Ethan slowed his steps slightly as they approached the exit. The night air waited beyond the glass doors, cool and familiar. Lily looked up at him again. Are you coming back tomorrow? She asked. He paused, just for a second. Then nodded. Yeah, he said. For a little while, she didn't ask more. She didn't need to. They stepped outside together, the city stretching out around them, loud, alive, unpredictable. And for once, that didn't feel like a threat. It felt manageable. Because this time, he wasn't stepping back into it blindly. He was choosing how far he went. And that made all the difference. He opened the car door for her, making sure she was settled before walking around to the driver's side. The routine was the same as always. But the path ahead? That had changed. Not into something chaotic, not into something overwhelming, but into something balanced. Something controlled. Something his. And somewhere behind them, in a room filled with people who once saw him as invisible, a shift had already taken root. They would remember this, not just the crisis, not just the solution, but the moment they realized that the person they overlooked was the one who understood everything. This isn't a story about a janitor being questioned. It's about how quickly power falls apart when it mistakes silence for lack of strength, and how real value doesn't need recognition to exist. Now tell me, what story should we uncover next? Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The mechanic they fired fixed the CEO's car for free, then drove away with the truth. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?